for that introduction. Hopefully, I'll live up to the start. So yeah, as Nigel also already said about my history, but I thought I'd start with just a selection of some interesting birds I've been lucky enough to catch and ring over the years, sort of to whet the appetite, as they say. I won't leave it on too long, so don't worry. But yeah, as you said, I started off sort of after university going to Bardsey, where I sort of gained my ringing license, as it were, when I got there. And when I was told to do this talk, Steve Kelly, who obviously isn't here tonight in the end, actually said he wanted to see some more photos of the humbugs, or for other people, black and white warblers. So I have done. Oh, hang on, let's see what goes to the next slide. We had this problem earlier. There you go. I have done a little sort of selection of some of the lovely birds that I was fortunate to see whilst on Bardsey. I'm sure some people in the crowd may not be too happy to see the photos of some of these species. So I won't stay on them too long. But obviously, it was sort of very fortunate to spend 3 years there. Lots of nice American birds. One of my little favourites, though, that I have included. I think there was a laser pointer here. Is this little fella down here, a fully white spotted flycatcher? That had to be one of the sort of cool, sort of not rare in terms of species, but quite rare in terms of plumage. And then, as I said, I then went on to this year. I was on the Calf of Man, um, um, and on there, I sort of got quite fortunate to see a selection of nice birds. I've just sort of included them for some completeness. Interestingly, um, being in North Wales, this species here, red rump swallow, it's not common, but I know there's been quite a few records this year on Bardsey. They did sort of very well, had quite a lot of records. We had a single bird on the Calf of Man, which was incredibly the first record for both the Calf of Man and the Isle of Man. I'm not too sure how, but yeah, it was quite a good one to get on the island list. Laughing Gull again was first for the Isle of Man, the Calf of Man, a bit more expected. Again, another unusual plumage. This was a hen harrier. This hen harrier, this fully white hen harrier, had been kicking around the Isle of Man for a few years. It does breed where they know it's a female, and it did come over just for the day. And when it came over, it did look like a little egret when I first saw it, I must admit, until you realised it was a harrier, not a little egret. We also got a couple of quails. They're quite an interesting story of these. I actually was going to check a razorbill nest. So we had this one razorbill chick, or egg actually, near where the boat comes in. It was kind of on its own. And I thought, as I'm passing, I'll go and have a look and see if it's hatched. And as I was walking up the headland, this is sort of exposed rocky headland, I flushed a quail, sort of fair Isle-esque, you could say. And I then called the rest of the team. They're going to bring down some thermal images. We thought, we might try and refine this. And whilst I was waiting, I thought, actually, I'll go and check this razorbill nest before I forget. And I walked back to where the razorbill nest was and flushed a second one from about 3 meters away, which I almost stood on. Unfortunately, both of them completely vanished. But the island itself is very bracken heavy, heather heavy, lots of vegetation for the birds to hide in, and a nice subalpine warbler. Interestingly, 2 years on Bardsey, I was fortunate to catch two eastern or male eastern subalpine warblers, and the Calf Man finally produced a western subalpine. But for any sort of keen birds in the crowd, apparently I shouldn't celebrate too early. This was caught in mid-May, which is quite late for Western subalpine. And though the plumage and the tail looks perfect, apparently there's been the odd sort of Western subalpine looking bird that's turned out to be Eastern from DNA. The DNA has now been sent off. I've got to hope it doesn't come back as an Eastern, because I wouldn't mind it staying as a Western. So then I moved down to Dorset. I moved down in July, and I have been living in Dorset since mid-July. And I have been getting out a little bit. I thought I'd include a selection of nice photos of some of the birds in this area. Some nice things. So Foister's tern locally in Poole Harbour. It's sort of quite a good bird that sort of has been returning year on year. Recently, we had a killdeer in Hampshire. Luckily, it was only about 35 minutes away. It was torrential rain, but it was kind of made it worthwhile. A few other nice things. So pine bunting, sort of a brief one-day bird. A great example of go when you can. We did that. I did that with the killdeer, and it ended up staying for a few days, and the weather cleared and it showed a lot better than when we saw it. But the pine bunting was literally a one-day bird, and it was only seen once in the afternoon. Key watching is a bit different down here to Bardsey in North Wales. Numbers are a lot lower. I went to Portland Bill a couple of times. Many of you may have been there. I was fortunate to see a few long-tailed skewers. I didn't think too much of it. I think we saw two. I thought, good day, two long-tailed skewers. It turned out to be the Assistant Warden's first ever long-tailed skewers, and they didn't actually have any last year. So it kind of shows you the difference. And any sort of skewer down in Dorset and Portland especially is quite unusual. However, Balearic shearwaters are sort of everywhere. You see more Balearic shores as a Manxes, which obviously is very different to the North Wales coast. And I have also included a nice photo of the grackle, just because you sort of had to go and see that. Um, I did go the day before people realised you could feed it out of your hand, so I never got the sort of the full artificial, hand feeding of the grackle. So just for anyone that's not aware, roughly where it is. So I'm now sort of based down here, roughly in Dorset, near Poole Harbour, near Wareham. And as Nigel said, I've been fortunate to get actual a paid ringing job. I'll maybe talk about that slightly in a few slides later, but just for the location, so everyone's aware roughly where we are. The ringing site is here. So it's actually not on the coast. I think I sort of, when I was advertising this talk, I sort of said it was inland. It's not inland, so to speak, because it is on the coast-ish in Dorset. And obviously, being in the south, you've got the whole of the north of the country above you, but we're not actually on the coast. We're sort of 5 miles inland, and that is kind of important because it is slightly different to coastal ringing and coastal birding, like on Bardsey or the Calf. You get different. It's very different how it works, and it also gets slightly better weather. Being on the sort of coast, it's a lot more windier than it is if you go a few miles inland. So obviously, it's also worth noting that it's very close to Poole Harbour. So this is Poole Harbour here. I believe I'm correct in saying this. It's the joint biggest harbour in the world. Sydney Harbour is slightly bigger. However, Sydney Harbour's been sort of urbanised and changed artificially over the years, so it's not really a natural anymore. And Sydney Harbour, importantly, is urbanised all the way around it. Poole Harbour has Poole and Bournemouth over here, but the whole of this side here is kind of wild still. And obviously, some of you may have been lucky to come down here, but Poole Harbour itself is important for birds. You get large numbers of avocets, especially in the winter. Lots of grebes currently around, lots of black-necked grebes, Savonian grebes. Spoonbills are a bit of a speciality down here. Birds of Poole Harbour, the local charity that do a lot of the work, have them as their logo, who I sort of work alongside. However, unfortunately, they're yet to breed down here. They sort of thought they might start breeding in Poole Harbour because it was sort of one of the first places they arrived to the UK. However, we do hold the record for the most spoonbills seen in the UK in a day. I was lucky to be on a boat trip. So the Birds of Poole Harbour do boat trips, sort of bird watching based boat trips around the harbour. And the day I was lucky to be on it, the UK record was broken. It was 116, I believe, on Brownsea. Unfortunately, by the time we got to Bardsey, because that was seen by a birdwatcher actually on the island, it was down to only 113. However, that was the UK record the day before. So there's quite significant numbers of spoonbills in the autumn here and also wintering. And obviously nice birds like spotted redshanks and little gulls. So the site itself, just being outside Wareham, is roughly this. It's not the best drawn area. It's not very big. It's about 160 acres in size. And it was part of a larger estate. So the Carey Estate itself was part of it was split into four many years ago. It was split between four children, and this part came up for sale. And it was bought by Mark Constantine, who runs Lush. Many of you may know him as the sort of founder of Lush. He's also an avid bird watcher and works as a sound approach, as many of you may have read his books. And he bought the site originally to release ospreys. They wanted a private site where they could do the osprey reintroduction to Dorset. That has now kind of come and gone and sort of it's up and running. And it was thought that the site could also be used as a ringing station. So I kind of realized I hadn't really included this in my talk until talking to Nigel before, but the site itself is being sort of set up as a ring station rather than, let's say, a bird observatory. It's a very unusual thing in the UK, as it were. You have obviously bird observatories where people can go and visit. They do daily census for at least 75% of the autumn, and they do a lot of ringing as part of that. But this site itself is basically ringing only. A daily census would be slightly, I guess, not worthwhile because obviously there's lots of resident birds, a lot more breeding birds than many bird observatories have to deal with. And you don't get sort of large falls or large numbers on certain days. And the idea is it's kind of going to sort of take on from some of the Netherlands where they have kind of ringing stations. And around the world where it's a bit more common, America has sites that are kind of dedicated just to ringing and kind of managed in that way. So the site itself, as my latest body comes back, is mainly woodland. It's sort of a mix of pine deciduous woodland. There's the house here, which is kind of main part of the state. This here is acid grassland. It's sort of heavily grazed by a very large number of sika deer. But I will slightly mention something along over here later on, just so you're aware. And then here is the floodplain. So this area here, since it's been bought in 2019, was heavily grazed. They've now basically left it to be rewilded, and it's starting to kind of grow up. And the ringing site itself is roughly in this red box, actually on the floodplain. So that's where we've been doing a lot of our ringing. And also on site is Carey's Secret Garden, which is like a sort of open garden. It's sort of another business on site that we sort of work alongside. It's a bit more, let's say, advertised online if you were looking for this area. So as I said, the site was originally bought for ospreys, and there's now an osprey nest on site. Unfortunately, they've been doing extremely well. I won't touch on it too much, but in simply the Osprey project has some issues with things like bird flu and COVID, and they didn't release as many as they sort of had a license to, due to these issues, kind of delaying the project. However, one pair returned to Carey to breed, and the last 2 years have had four young, which is apparently less than 1% of osprey nests fledge four young. So the fact it's done it twice in a row is kind of exceptional. And it's kind of boosted the reintroduction and kind of made it a success, because they never expected sort of wild breeding birds to do that well. So the site itself, I didn't take too many photos of, I must admit. I'm not really necessarily good at taking photos. Is like I sort of said, it's kind of floodplain with sedge and reed and sort of sedge and long grass growing up. And there's the odd bits of sort of willow and alder, which were in sort of old drainage ditches when it was farmed. They put in sort of artificial drainage ditches, and the deer can't really get to them. And I won't necessarily talk today about what is bird ringing and how it's done, because I know a lot of people are aware of it. Some of the people in the crowd are bird ringers themselves. It's done through the BTO, or the British Trust for Ornithology, and they have a website that talks through everything about how it's done, sort of the ethics and how, and the importance of it. So I won't touch on that too much and sort of spend time talking about that. But in general, we use mist nets, which many of you will be aware of, which were set sort of along the edge of these sort of wet ditches. Here's the other thing noted in these photos are these here are osprey platforms. They're mini osprey platforms that they used. So when they released the ospreys on site, they used to feed them from these platforms under the cover of darkness, so they didn't get used to humans. And they've sort of left them up as as sort of a thing to sort of remember it by. And there's another photo here. This is the only other photo I got. These are actually my partner's photo. I didn't actually take any photos of the site. I'm not very good at necessarily taking those sort of photos. And when you come to do a talk like this, you realize you kind of need them. But this kind of shows the site. So the nets would be along these sort of tree line here. Along here is sort of the woodland on the other side of the river. There's a big woodland here along the side of the river, but most of the nets were along these sort of in between this like sort of sedgy grassland. There is a tent here. There were days where if I was going to bed early, sort of late and getting up early, I did camp on site. I didn't always camp on site, but when you're sort of doing sunrise every day and you also want to go out at night and try and catch other things, you realize that you sometimes, you need to sleep on site. So this was the rough layout of the nets for anyone that's interested. We did have sort of 22 permanent nets. This was color coordinated for a different report, but these nets here were the ones we mainly used along the ditches and along the river. Some of these were trial nets that we didn't actually try. But it was quite a large number of nets were actually set and sort of used daily. Basically, every day at dawn, if possible, the nets were open. Officially, I was told to do it 5 days a week for 30 to 35 hours, but it's obviously what you do on your day off. You go ringing, so why don't you just go ringing at work? So I did used to sort of try and do it basically every day I could for as long as possible. We did have issues with, for any of you that might be aware, a black net is quite hard to see, but when it's sunny, they do light up in the sun and you struggle to catch birds. And that was one of the issues with the site. It was also very open. There's not much cover. So we did have issues with the wind, which would be a major problem for by the coast, but as we're a bit further inland. It's also on this photo, you can kind of see the river here. So this is the River Piddle, which joins the Froome and goes into the Wareham Channel and Poole Harbour. It's quite a narrow river, but so it was sort of quite shallow as well because we actually had nets going across the river, as it were. So the talk will mainly focus on, I think, migration basically, and sort of what goes through a typical site, you could so to speak. during the year. Most of the birds that we recorded of interest were in nets. However, we did have a few things that we couldn't catch, predominantly the birds of prey. So white-tailed eagles are now a big feature here in Dorset and down south. There was, as many as you may know, a successful reintroduction to the Isle of Wight. We now do have one breeding pair in Poole Harbour themselves, which fledged a young, one young, and we do used to get them quite regularly. The other day we had a migration festival, and they actually had four go over at once, and there was a record of eight together this sort of summer over Wareham, just a couple of miles away. So that was sort of very sort of amazing to see these down south. We also had a few unusual things like hen harrier, a nice male hen harrier went through one day, and honey buzzard. There's a local breeding pair, and every now and then they would come over. Unfortunately, every time they came over, I was ringing and didn't have a camera, so this actually was taken nearby. So over the course of the year, we've basically tried to ring every day from the 14th of July when we set the nets through till mid-November. And we caught obviously a selection of species. Here's an example of some of the things that I won't necessarily go into tonight, as we sort of caught them in very small numbers. Interestingly, field fare, we actually only caught one, and it was quite a poor autumn for field fare. However, I won't exploit too much, but it wasn't necessarily a poor autumn for other things. And over the course of the year, we actually did 783 hours of ringing, or at least that's what Trek Tellen told me. And we caught well, 11,417 birds. So of this also includes retraps, the birds that were already ringed that we caught again. So we caught 10 and a half, roughly, thousand new birds. So quite a huge number of birds were using one sort of field. And as the nets are sort of set every day in the same location, and there wasn't a huge amount of habitat, as I showed on the photos, it's sort of short sedge with a few bushes. It was kind of an islandy sort of habitat in a way, and it resulted in sort of very few retraps. So there were wrens and robins that were resident on the site, but there wasn't a huge number of sort of breeding birds actually around the nets. There were in the nearby woodlands, but not actually around the nets. So it did mean we didn't catch a huge number of birds over and over again, especially once they sort of got used to the nets. And also it's worth noting on this map is this is 100 birds in total. So we had quite a few days where we had over 100 birds, which is just significant numbers. And one day we'll talk about this later where we managed to get over 600. It also shows you sort of how often we were ringing. There was, the odd time, a couple of days here and there where it was too windy to ring. But I think if I did the same graph for Bardsey or the Calf of Man or somewhere for mist nets open, I know when I was on Bardsey from September through to November, if you could ring twice a week, you were doing well. Normally it was once a week. In October, you might open the nets two or three times, or you might get a dry spell for a couple of days and not be able to ring for 2-3 weeks. So sort of being inland and sort of, I guess, being in a non-ideal migration location, it does allow you to sort of ring more often and sort of, I guess, over the course of the year, ring more birds. And it's sort of because it's way more consistent. So one of the species that I guess was one of the highlights for me at least, and possibly the highlight in a UK term were these grasshopper warblers. Now, many of you will probably agree with me that they're not a bird watchers see very often. In the spring, you might be lucky enough to hear some. There might be the odd pair breeding here and there. But normally you've got to go to a specific location to sort of see one. You've got to go to a certain habitat. And in the autumn, they kind of pass through very unnoticed. And this is sort of shown like amazingly in a way, because on the other side of the river, when I showed the map earlier, is Wareham Common. And there's a local birder there who has only seen grasshopper warbler a handful of times. He didn't see him on the whole of last autumn until sort of late autumn when he actually came over to my side of the river to see one in the hands, as it were. And that shows you sort of, I guess, how sort of secretive these birds were. Because we ended up catching, as it showed here, just over 480 grasshopper warblers. So there were huge numbers of grasshopper warblers going through Dorset. And in general, there are no breeding grasshopper warblers in the local area. There was one bird the year before last, 2024, that was calling on site in the spring. but that never bred. And there aren't really that many, if any, local breeding grasshopper warblers. So these are basically all migrants. And the other sort of important thing with this graph I'll show you on here is the dates. So I think one take-home message, if anything, from the talk would be autumn, as it were, or birders autumn, doesn't start in August, in September. It starts in July. So the first day of ring was the 16th of July, and I think we caught six grasshopper warblers. So that's mid-July. It was really, really hot, nice summer weather, and these birds are already moving south. And our peak day was the 18th of July, where we had 27, which a lot of people, you might even think the breeding season's not over by July, but these birds are already on their way and on their way south. And obviously, being on the south coast, these birds have probably started 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, if they were coming from Scotland. The other interesting thing about the graph, I tried to split adults and juveniles, kind of show you how few adults we actually caught. We only caught 24 adults. And most of these, the sample size is obviously quite small, occurred later on. And this is kind of what you expect with migratory warblers. The juveniles, when their parents had enough of them, will kick them off and they'll start dispersing, they'll start moving earlier. And the adults, with some species, can have more than one brood, so we'll expect to sort of arrive slightly later. And obviously they sort of go through until kind of mid-September, but in general we had a peak is sort of the end of July and then another sort of smaller peak in mid-August. So if you're out on your local patch, looking for grasshopper warblers, you should be looking for them from mid-July. Maybe before, we put the nets up on the 14th of July. Unfortunately, it was too windy and we didn't start until the 16th of July. We caught six, and obviously then suddenly we caught loads and loads. And this year we'll hopefully start a little bit earlier. So we'll be quite intrigued to know if, we'd already missed 50, 60 birds a couple of days before. And for anyone, sort of another thing ringing, I guess, can show you, which a lot of bird watchers perhaps don't get the sort of the privilege to see, is the birds up close. And with a lot of birds, we can obviously age them. And warblers, or a lot of the UK warblers, things like grasshopper warblers, sort of acros, sylvias, will molt when they leave us. So they'll molt once they have done their migration. So in the autumn, the adults are basically worn and battered. So this top photo here shows a very worn adult bird. It's got very warm primaries, very sort of bleached brown, sort of chipped primaries. And that's basically because it would have molted pre-breeding, and it's done the whole breeding season. It had to feed its young, look for food every day. And basically it's now battered. It's had a hard time and it looks battered. Whereas the juveniles, they've just come out of the nest, they've just grown their brand new primaries, their brand new feathers, and they look nice, glossy, and black. And here we have another adult sort of showing sort of slightly battered. It's actually like sort of here you can sort of see how the sort of feathers are really battered, and obviously a very battered, worn sort of tail. So out of all those grasshopper warblers we caught, sort of 480, it's roughly sort of 15 to 20% of the UK's total number of grasshopper warblers you'd expect to catch in a year. And I've actually forgot to mention earlier, so the site itself started ringing in 2024. A different ringer was paid to ring through that autumn. And I haven't included their data in this, mainly because it's in the early stages and net positionings haven't really been decided. So we did try nets in different places, and that did, we moved a few nets, and that had a huge impact on the number of birds we caught. And lots of things weren't necessarily standardized yet because it's only the second year of the project. So it's quite hard to compare sort of year on year. So I haven't done that here. But last year, again, I think the guy did about just under 300 grasshopper warblers. So still huge sort of numbers in a UK term. Interestingly, we only caught one bird that had already had a ring on. So with ringing, there's obviously lots of different reasons to do it. Simply mark and recapture how many birds are passing through a site. It's probably the most interesting thing for this site specifically. But obviously, we want to know more about their movements. And the only bird we caught was a bird that was caught in Wiltshire in August the year before. Again, probably on migration. It was caught in late August, and we caught it again in early August. So it sort of shows you where they're coming from. But out of all those birds, we didn't have many, if any, anyway, I only had one with a ring on. The other sort of, I guess, key species that the site had in, I think, quite extraordinary numbers are sedge warblers. So we caught 2,200-ish sedge warblers, which it's just huge numbers of sedge warblers passing through one site. And like, obviously the site is by a river, but the river is sort of east to westerly. It's not a major river. There's not too many landmarks in the area. There obviously is Poole Harbour, but we're a few miles away from that. So these birds are just sort of passing through the landscape. So it makes you wonder how many birds are passing through the landscape. There's nothing too special about the site. It is quite good habitat for feeding sedge warblers, but there's loads of places like this all the way along the south coast. So it makes you suddenly realise, the sheer number of birds passing through. It's also worth noting briefly is the aging of these. So again, they've got really, really nice fresh primaries. And sedge warblers is also worth noting. I didn't have a good photo of this, but they have this sort of collar on their sort of chest. Juveniles have this. They vary. Some juveniles have a much broader collar than others. So as a result, it was a bit more mixed, and this probably was to do with the fact that perhaps the site was better for sedge warblers, or there was more local breeding sedge warblers sort of passing through, and so adults were coming through. We did a few peaks in August, but yeah, autumn migration for sedge warblers is the end of July. It's not sort of September and October. Unlike grasshoppers, though, we did get a lot more with rings on. Though, as a sort of in a UK term, we actually ringed a lot less as a percentage of the number of sedge warblers that are ringed in the UK. We did have quite a good number of rings on. I've only included the birds that were ringed sort of this year or sort of in 2025. There were a few that were ringed in previous years. They didn't really tell you much. And it kind of shows you quite nicely how fast birds are passing through the country. Sort of as you expect, bird from Scotland took 50 days, Ireland 30, and a few from South Wales. Some only took sort of 5 days, only 9 days to get from Yorkshire. And there seems to be a slightly westerly bias. And then these are birds on the sort of the red birds are birds that we ringed. And these are birds that are probably worked their way to the coast. They were all juvenile birds. They didn't really know where they were going and they ended up going the wrong way. Or the wind changed and they were getting pushed sort of back the way they came and they sort of headed back north, which kind of seems counterintuitive. But I will touch on that later about exactly why birds might be doing this. I will sort of put your attention towards these two birds, though. So these were Cornwall birds. One was from Nanjizzle, another sort of famous ringing site, a ringing site where people do it all volunteering. It's sort of all run voluntary, unlike here where luckily we had somebody to fund the sort of the rings and the time. But we actually had a bird that took about 11 days to get from them to us, another bird that came from Cornwall. And these birds you would have thought are kind of going the wrong way. Why are they going east when they could just go straight south and straight to France? And this is sort of, there's a bit of a logic to this. So we also did have two of our birds. We didn't get any of our birds caught in sort of Kent or Sussex, but two of our birds were caught in France. So here are two birds that flew to France. And these seem to suggest they were following a kind of a rule. And this might be known by some of you, but hopefully not everyone. So in general, the idea is in the spring, birds want to get back to breeding grounds as fast as possible. They want to get back, they need to get their territory, they need to look for mates, and they're in a rush. And birds will head due north. They'll go as fast as they can to where they need to get to. And places like Portland Bill here does very well in the spring. It gets large fours of large numbers of birds. But in the autumn, it gets very, very few birds. There was a day I went where they caught a wryneck and a booted warbler. I went to try and twitch the booted warbler, spoke to the warden, and he caught 8 birds all morning. It was like one chiffchaff, one willow warbler. I just caught 150 birds that morning. And, I'm only a few miles away inland, sort of, 20 miles away. And basically, no birds go to Portland in the autumn. In the spring, yes, they're going north, they hit the coast and they hit Portland because it sticks out. In the autumn, the birds head across the south coast. And the idea is they do sort of this route. And that's specifically because they're not in a rush. They're not in a rush to get to breeding grounds. They're in good conditions, lots of food around late summer, and they work their way across the UK, cross at the shortest crossing, because obviously it's easier. And this was shown probably by these two birds that would have made this sort of short crossing and then headed south. However, it's not a definite rule because we did have this one bird that did that. It could have gone the long way around, but 4 days is quite quick. It makes you wonder if it did just go straight south. Though interestingly, this was an adult. So whereas those other two birds that went to France were juveniles, this one was an adult. So it may mean that more juveniles sort of take this sort of shortcut and adults might just go for it because they're in much better condition. They know what they're doing. They know where they're going. So when you're catching large numbers of sedge warblers and grasshopper warblers, there's always the hope, and it was kind of part of the site itself, was that you might catch one of these. So this, obviously, if anyone that's not aware, is a aquatic warbler. The rarest passerine in Europe. Someone told me the other day it's the only red-listed passerine in Europe, in a sort of an international terms, and they're down to around 5,000 to 6,000 singing males. So they're extremely rare, mainly in Eastern Europe. But Poland has a large number, and they're doing okay there. But in general, they are struggling, and mainly with farming. And the idea of the site was being on the south coast, being in Dorset. If we ring every day, we might catch one, and we were lucky enough to do so. Interestingly, it was the 2nd of September when we finally caught one. A few other sites had already had some this year. It seemed a slightly better year for them down on the south coast. And it almost was looking like we weren't going to get one. And it was one of those days where it almost didn't happen. I woke up, it was heavy rain. The forecast had kind of changed overnight, as it seemed to always do. I drove to the site and I was sat in the car. It was just raining. It was quite windy. And I was like, we might as well call it a day. But then another local ringer came down because he was going to come and join me. We looked at the weather and it kind of like it was going to stop in about half an hour. And he was like, well, I'm out of bed now. Why don't we just see what happens? So we waited about half an hour. It was about 6 o'clock by now. The sun was, well, there wasn't a sun because it was raining, but it was light. It was getting light. And the rain did stop and the wind dropped. And so we opened the nets. And then about an hour later, it started raining again. And we were like, oh, this is not very good. We'd caught a few birds, nothing too much. And about half an hour later, the rain stopped and we reopened the nets. And about half an hour later, about 9:30, this bird went in. So it just make sort of that old saying of like, don't give up. If it's raining, still go out, bird watch. You still go out because you never quite know. And we think, looking at the map radar for that day, there'd been a day of southeasterlies. It sort of shifted overnight to a sort of a brief southeasterly, and as a result, the idea was this bird got pushed across the English Channel. So aquatic warblers should pass through France. They should pass through Western Europe. And if the wind's right, they just clip the south coast of the UK. And the weather turned very briefly about 4 a.m. to southeasterly and brought with it rain. And that probably was enough to push this aquatic warbler across the channel. Much to the sort of detest of one of the local ringers who also sort of goes out another site nearby to try and catch them and didn't quite look at the weather and didn't realize it was going to do this. And I hadn't really looked that hard at the weather. But it's again, it's sort of a good example of just giving it a go, and sort of having a go because you never quite know. So that was kind of probably the highlight of the year. I kind of started early, but I've kind of gone through the autumn from start to finish. But it may be worth noting, especially for some birders. I know a few people in the crowd were kind of jealous and may not have seen one, but the local ring or the guy, I actually didn't find it in the net. Another guy did, and it was his 29th he'd seen in the hand, and it was apparently the 105th the local ring group had ringed. So down in Dorset, they were a lot more regular, and the idea is that by ringing every day and having this ringing site here, that we might start seeing more and more of these. And as they do sort of breed a lot of large areas of Eastern Europe, some of it's quite hard to sort of survey. That the numbers being caught in sort of France and the UK each year can be used as kind of a metric to work out their population, but which hopefully is going to be going in the right direction. So I've obviously taken some photos of birds in the hand, and some nice photos to sort of add to the talk. There were some photos I was struggling to find, and sort of in August, I accidentally fell into a wet bog one day, but that's a slightly different story. And it turns out I didn't have any photos of sort of the last acro warbler that I was going to discuss, which was reed warbler. So unfortunately, there's just a graph for them. But in general, they were actually quite rare. We caught just under 300 reed warblers. So where we were catching over 2,000 sedge warblers and 480 grasshopper warblers, we only caught 296 reed warblers. So yeah, reasonably, I don't really know why. I think it's sort of the site was low sedge and it was good for sort of sedge and grasshopper, but just not quite high enough or enough cover perhaps for reed warbler. But there was a few pairs along the river actually breeding on site. And this is probably, these early birds are probably representative of this. In late July, reed warblers can have up to 3 broods, and we did actually find some chicks in mid-August that were still being fed in a nest at a different site locally. So they were probably on 3rd broods. And this is probably why you sort of see a peak early on in July where you get the juveniles passing through, and then later on in August you start seeing more adults and more juveniles, and they can carry on right through till September with a random one in October. But we only caught 296 reed warblers. We actually caught quite a few that were, or a couple that were already ringed. So whereas grasshopper warblers just so few seem to be ringed, we did slightly better, and we had sort of three birds here that were already ringed. Again, we had a bird that I hope it's not being cut off, but yeah, somewhere up here came from South Scotland. Another bird from Staffordshire, again slightly westerly bias to our birds. Perhaps the easterly ones sort of take the shortcut, and we get sort of the way at Welsh birds passing through. But the most interesting one is this one down here. So this bird we caught with a Brussels ring on it, so from Belgium. But the interesting part was it was a juvenile. So we didn't know exactly, when it was ringed, where it was ringed, but I knew it was a juvenile, so it had to be ringed that autumn. And incredibly, yeah, it took only 25 days, and it took this rather random route. And this is probably an example of the route the aquatic warblers take. So it probably wasn't born in Belgium. It was ringed in sort of mid-August in Belgium before we caught it in September. And it probably was moving from sort of a lot further east, or maybe the Netherlands, and it was moving across Europe. And the wind may have changed overnight and sort of cut it across, and it ended up coming across to us here. So that was quite a cool little sort of different migration to sort of your normal north-south. We did also have another bird that went a bit further before it was recovered. So we zoom out a little bit, and we had one bird that ended up going to Spain, Portugal. Sorry, not Spain. Unfortunately, it was killed by a cat. However, it does show you that, it's sort of an example of where you get your ringing data from. But it sort of shows you. I always would love to know which route it took. Did it sort of go through France, or did it just go for it and cut across the sea? 22 days, quite a long time, so it probably did slowly make its way down there. So another species, a slightly more unusual one that was sort of passing through the site in okay numbers were these. So tree pipits, quite a nice bird, quite a subtle bird, but I think they're quite pretty in the hand. And these were another bird that were passing through sort of almost from the off. We only ended up catching 50, but August showed quite a big influx of tree pipits. Now, for any ringers, tree pipits aren't necessarily an easy bird to catch, as many will know. They can see the nets quite well. So on sunny days, we did struggle to catch them. So this kind of up and down of zero birds and lots of birds was probably more an example of the weather rather than an example of sort of when birds are moving. But again, these were sort of an August to September. They do breed locally in Dorset. So some of these early July birds might have been local breeders. But these are birds to look out for wherever you are in August. Another species that was passing the site sort of early on in the autumn are willow warblers, quite an iconic species. And these again were moving through sort of in July. The minute it hits mid-July, these birds are on their way. We did reasonably well. We caught 468 willow warblers, and most of the peaks were sort of July. A couple of peaks in late July. We did also have some in August and a few in September. So they are a bit more spread out than maybe the sedge warblers and grasshopper warblers. But again, sort of quite a big, strong peak in end of July. And interesting about these that I've included here is the sort of times we caught them. So I've just very briefly drawn for the number caught in a 15-minute period. And unlike sort of sedge warblers and grasshopper warblers, where you catch a lot early on, they seem to be a lot more spread out. So if you're on an island or on the coast, you sort of expect these large falls. The birds are passing through, something happens, weather changes, they all just land, and they land wherever they have to, i.e., the first land they see, the coast. However, when you're inland a bit more, and you've got birds passing through the sort of the local area as the day goes on, you get a sort of a much more broader range. And we did get quite a lot of birds sort of between 9 and 10 o'clock. And these are birds that were just passing through going south, just working their way through the woodlands, through the hedgerows, down towards the coast. And this is probably something you wouldn't necessarily see on an island where, you open the nets and you catch most of the birds straight away, whatever's there, you catch them. We're seeing these kind of sort of mid-morning arrivals. And that was shown a bit later on, actually, with another species. Now, another species that, when you talk about migratory birds, you might not be the first one you think of, but our migrant that go down to Africa are these nightjars. Such incredible birds. We're fortunate actually to do relatively well this year catching them. And obviously they do breed locally. There's lots of heaths not too far away. but they also do migrate, and you will be getting birds from further north. Interestingly, I did much better. We seem to catch lots of these pre-dawn. So anyone that is a ringer or wanted to catch any, I didn't do too well in the evenings, caught the odd one. And in the mornings, I would get up about an hour and a half before sunrise, have very little success until it was just getting light. And the minute you could basically see well enough to see where you were going, birds would start going into the nets. Presumably, these were birds that were migrating. They saw the sun starting to come up and just were like, oh, I need to find somewhere to roost for the day. We ended up catching 41, which is, I think, quite good for a site that they don't breed at. But it obviously is a good site for them feeding. And again, they were kind of split into two kind of sections. So we had this sort of late July, early August, which was when I sort of started trying. Dare I say it, this bird was actually caught by someone else before I got there. And that was a selection of adults and juveniles. And these were probably birds that bred locally, juveniles dispersing or adults flying to the floodplain to open areas, got lots of insects, lots of food. And then we had a bit of a break before we had this kind of quite good run at the start of September. And these were definitely migrants. These were birds that were passing through the site. A couple of these birds actually caught more than once, which suggested they were kind of staying in the local area. But these just went straight through. And this seemingly is the best time. The first week or two of September, if you want to try and find a nightjar anywhere in the UK, that's when they're passing through. I know some other people in the UK that were also trying that week quite intensively to try and catch them. But they are definitely a bird that sort of goes through the UK completely unnoticed. They probably pass through most sites without anyone ever seeing them, just due to their secretive behaviour. So two other species that I've included, the sort of iconic species, I guess, of the autumn are garden warblers and blackcaps. And I always feel like these kind of go together, garden warblers and blackcaps, because garden warblers kind of look like a black cap without its black cap or its orange cap in the female. But they actually had very different kind of timings. As you can see, we did a lot better for black cap. We only caught 54 garden warblers, but we caught 1,160 black caps. So again, huge numbers of black caps. And this is really with the wrong habitat. We had a small area of brambles and scrub, but very small, which we caught most of them in. But the habitat itself, as it starts to rewild, hopefully we'll start planting more up. It could get much better for these species, but at the moment it's not great. And this again was, I guess, why I didn't compare to last year, because last year they only caught 300 blackcaps, but we did move some nets to another area where we did better for them. However, other parts of the UK saw this huge number of blackcaps and chiffchaffs and sedge warblers this year. And it seemed that it seemed to be a very, very good breeding season. Adult survival was very high. Lots of birds survived the breeding season, and lots of birds had multiple broods. And there was just huge numbers of birds. Many of you may know Stamford Reservoir in sort of the Midlands or the East Midlands. They had record numbers for blackcap, sedge warbler, and chiffchaff, I believe. So they've been doing it for 50 years, and they had their highest ever numbers of each of those species this year, which just shows what a great breeding season it was. But yeah, it's worth noting that garden warbler was sort of there again. They were late July, early August. That sort of key time for some of our species are passing through then. Whereas blackcap, the complete opposite. They're sort of late August through till September, with a few in kind of into early October. So they're September, and that's kind of the start of, I guess, our sort of second half of the autumn. And there was kind of a bit of a time in kind of late August where it kind of went a bit quiet because the sedge warblers were ending and we hadn't quite got the blackcaps or the chiffchaffs passing through. These birds here early on are probably just local breeders. We did have a few blackcaps breeding on site. But there seemed to be quite a strong sort of split between garden warbler and blackcap. I always think of them as the same, but they do move at completely different times. The garden warblers, most of them, apart from some of these sort of stragglers, were long gone before the blackcap started. And we also thought I'd split male and female blackcaps just for interest, and perhaps to briefly talk about the issues with tape luring. So many of you may know that tape lures are used when ringing to attract birds to the area where your nets are. And this normally has a bit of a bias towards males and usually towards juveniles, because males are usually more territorial, so more likely to come to tape. And juveniles are usually a bit more stupid or naive, and are kind of coming to the tape. Perhaps they think it's their food, or it's mum and dad feeding me. So as you can see, we did get slightly more males than females, as you expect. But generally, there wasn't really much correlation between timings and what we got. We did get a few blackcaps again with rings on. Nothing too that interesting. Not as many from the east. Much more sort of west. Yeah, we didn't really get any from Wales, unlike the sedge warblers. But that could just be a sort of where people are. I recently went to a ringers conference at Slimbridge, and there was someone doing a talk about great white egrets there, talking about colouring them and where they were getting resighted. And she did make a comment, which I thought was quite good, of where they were getting resighted could literally just be a map of where there are bird watchers with cameras resighting the birds. And this could be the same with the ringing. It's very hard with only sort of a few birds to kind of have any sort of take any data from this, because this could literally just be a map of who was ringing blackcaps that week. Um, especially, with people with jobs, if you're only ringing once a week, you could have missed large numbers. So this could literally just be, where there were people ringing when those black caps were passing through. So another species that the next species, I guess, is kind of away from your typical migrants, so to speak. And it's this one. So it's a favorite of many people, the kingfisher, and not many people would sort of think of this as a migrant, but it is. It's not a migrant in terms of going to Africa, leaving the UK, but they are short distance migrants. They disperse and they migrate, and they do follow river systems. And we saw this at Carey. There was birds that were migrating along the River Piddle towards the harbour. And this is what you'll see from kind of mid-July. Juveniles get kicked out, and you'll start seeing them at the coast. And this is when you start seeing your wintering birds arriving in harbours, lakes, and along coastal sites. For anyone that doesn't know, I thought it was quite interesting just to add it on. Aging kingfishers is relatively straightforward, or there's lots of different ways, but one of the nice ways is they have this kind of dark color and a lot more duller than the adults. They also have sort of dark shin pads and dark sort of fronts to their feet, which the adults don't or don't generally. And this means you can age them. So we did see quite a few birds in Poole Harbour along sort of the sort of urban areas of Poole Harbour, and all of these were juveniles. And it's just the juveniles sort of that pass through to winter. And I did include, and oh yeah, and here's that. Here's just a brief graph of this is actually of 4 years at Carey, so it's slightly more hours, but 66 kingfishers have ever been caught at Carey. And again, you sort of see, you get the odd ones later on, which are probably resident adults, resident birds that are staying. But you get this huge influx of birds in July and August. And there were times where each day we catch one or two new kingfishers. The next day there'll be another new kingfisher, then another new kingfisher. And they are just continuously passing through, perhaps unnoticed. And I think many people don't realize, the local kingfisher on the river isn't necessarily the same one every single day. So as I said, we sort of try to ring every single day. Another positive of this is that when you're ringing and you've got nets up, you never know what you might catch. So whereas generally we're targeting sort of the migratory warblers, we were lucky to catch a few other nice things, a sort of kind of bycatch, if that's the right word. One of them was this rather nice male hobby. I thought I'd include it because it's not really a bird you get to see up this close. It's sort of very fortunate to catch it. A really nice adult male hobby. And though we only caught one, and whether or not it'll ever be seen again, there's still things to learn about these things. Quite interestingly, I was talking to a local ringer in Dorset who's hoping to tag with GPS tags adult hobbies this year. And I told him the weight of this male. It was actually below the weight that he thought they could be. And he now needs to reconsider the tags and perhaps try and get some slightly lighter tags, just in case he catches some that are this light. Whether or not the reason we caught it was because it was slightly underweight. It was going after a robin when it flew into the net. But perhaps it was just an example, at the time. I can't really remember if the weather wasn't great and there wasn't that many insects around. And that's why it was kind of choosing to hunt passerines instead of going for other food. But yeah, it was sort of chase the robin into the net and end up the nets. But there's still obviously things to learn, there's still very little we know about some of sort of our sort of iconic species simply because you just catch so few. So we then move on from sort of the gorgeous, lovely hobby to something that's slightly, not going to say boring, but a sort of a love-hate relationship with the chiffchaffs. So there's always a thing when you're ringing or bird watching that you always want to see things, or when ringing, you want to catch birds, you want to catch large numbers of birds. On quiet days when there's no birds, everyone kind of moans and goes, "Oh, I wish there was more. It's a bit quiet today. It's a bit boring." And then suddenly you can get the opposite, where you can't be happy because suddenly you've got too much, and you can't cope. And chiffchaffs are kind of example of that. there were just huge numbers of chiffchaffs that passed through the UK this year. Most sites around the UK saw record-breaking numbers. I think Portland Bill caught more chiffchaffs. It sort of broke its record number of chiffchaffs for the autumn in about 3 days. And this was very similar to Carey. Here is the sort of the graph. So we ended up catching just under 3,000 chiffchaffs. I think it was like 2,800 new birds. Again, it's very small numbers in July and August and September. Most of these were local breeding birds. There was a few pairs that bred on site. And then suddenly we just got this massive influx. And there were just huge numbers. And this is a great example of how ringing is a completely different survey to bird watching. Because if you bird watch and I stood there all day, I would have counted a lot of these chiffchaffs, but you would never have known exactly how many were there. Because you can never count that many. We had 3 days of over 200 new chiffchaffs, and we just didn't catch any twice. I think in this sort of week period, I think we only caught two twice in the same day. There was a few local birds that kind of stuck around from in July and August, and we caught them a couple of times. But in this period, only two birds were caught twice in the same day. So we were releasing them, and they were just leaving, and there were also just continuous passages of birds. And this is another example of where migration isn't always in the morning. We had one day where we had quite a good morning. We caught, I can't exactly remember how many, but a reasonable number. And about 9 o'clock, it had gone quite quiet. And at 9:30, we caught one chiffchaff. That was the only bird. And I had somebody with me. I had a few ringers there on site that day, and somebody said, "Oh, I'm going to go home. It's dead. There's nothing here. It's kind of come and gone. We had a good morning." Um, and then, the next round, I think at 10 o'clock, we caught three or four birds. It's like, I'll carry on. Let's see what happens. And then at about 10:30 or the next round, we caught 50 chiffchaffs. And then that day, I think, was this day here, we caught over 200. It just suddenly there was, we had a good push of maybe 80 chiffchaffs before 9 o'clock. And then just from about 10:30 through to about 2 o'clock, we were catching continuous chiffchaffs, and they were just passing through. And I think the reason for that I will touch on later, but the weather at the time was just sort of perfect for migration. Very briefly, unfortunately, we caught a lot of chiffchaffs. We didn't end up catching any perfect Siberian chiffchaffs, or any really. The previous year in 2024, the guy did catch two Siberian chiffchaff. He also caught 8 yellow-browed warblers. We didn't catch a single yellow-browed warbler this year, but I think it was a very poor year for yellow-browed warblers. There was very few in Dorset. Portland Bill only had two. There was the odd bird dotted around, but very few numbers compared to previous year. We did get this kind of pale chiffchaff, but it didn't call anything like Siberian, unfortunately, and it was probably some kind of intergrade of somewhere that way. I'm not going to try and guess what type of chiffchaff it was. But obviously, catching large numbers of chiffchaffs, again, we had good numbers of birds with rings on. They had a bit more of an easterly bias to them. I don't know, I'm making this up, but a lot of our sedge warblers and grass warblers seem to come from the west. A lot of the chiffchaffs seem to come from the east. Whether or not they take different migration routes, I don't know. But at the time, it was strong northerly and strong northwesterly wind. Or not strong, but that was the sort of prominent wind direction. We had about 5 or 6 days of just northwest northerly winds. And birds love that in the autumn. So a lot of these birds, as many of you know, are nocturnal migrants. They migrate through the night. So they make their way south. And if the wind's behind, that's perfect. It blows them south. They get blown south back, so to where they want to go. But when it gets light, they do the opposite. So I kind of been learning this a bit more this year. Some of you might know this, but the theory is most birds in the day will move into the wind. So overnight, let's say it's northerly, they get pushed south, they go with the wind behind them. Then once it gets light, they turn around and go back the way they came. Obviously, during the day, they move a lot smaller distances. They just they don't take to the sky and fly. They just kind of move through the trees, fly short distances between bushes and hedgerows. But they basically go into the wind. And the theory is, if you've got bad weather coming, heavy rain, wind, you don't want to move away from it, because once it catches up with you, you're then stuck inside the rain with it for a long time. And if it's moving the same speed you're moving, you'll move with the rain and end up just never leaving the rain. The birds move into the wind with the wind going into them. So then if rain or bad weather does come, they should move through it quickly. And this was shown perfectly here, where we had this bird here. It was caught at Durlston. Some of you may be aware, a sort of coastal site where another local ringer in the group rings. It was caught in the morning, and we caught it at Carey the same day. 9 hours and 8 minutes later. That was the exact time difference between the ringing records. Obviously, the bird was caught in a net. It probably, might have gone in the net 10 minutes before. And so the timing's exact, but roughly 9 hours it took this bird to travel 5 miles inland, sort of away from where it should be going. And this again is the theory is the birds will be moving south. They'll probably hit the sea, realize they can't cross, turn back, end up at the coast, and then during the course of the day they'll move into the headwind. And this bird again, this was the next day actually. This was both sort of day after, went north again. It did do it overnight, but again, if it was in poor condition, it wouldn't have wanted to move. So it might have just needed to feed, and again headed into the wind. So this is kind of the sort of, I guess, the sort of the theory behind migration and why some birds do move. And again, with the sedge warblers, I showed you a few of them went north, a few of them went west, and they sort of will do these sort of short distance in, I guess, the wrong direction. So we've sort of moved on to some other species. I kind of included these for completeness, just to kind of show you kind of how poor it was for some, I guess. So obviously some sites do better than others just due to habitat. And this site just wasn't very good for whitethroat. We caught 74 whitethroats. Again, you get sort of August and early September is when these are moving in their numbers, but very few. And lesser whitethroat, we only caught five, sort of very, very poor numbers of lesser whitethroat. We did get this bird in September, which I kind of had more hopes for, but unfortunately it was just sort of your nominant lesser whitethroat, very little white on T4, just a lot of white on the outer. It wasn't sort of anything from sort of eastern whitethroat, unfortunately, which were turning up at the time. So very few numbers of whitethroat and lesser whitethroat, but again, probably just a lack of scrub habitat on site. Just sort of again, just to include them, redstart again, not really many numbers, but they're another August September migrant, as is spotted flycatcher. We had a few early August, but I think that was more because they do breed actually next to the house on site, so it's hard to know exactly which ones are migrants and which ones are not. These are all birds ever ringed, so I think last year we did 11 red starts. There's only been 16 ever ringed on site, so very few numbers, but obviously still a nice bird. And it was quite a good autumn for red starts. A lot of local people had a lot more red starts. They're generally a rarer bird, so when you only catch sort of 12, it doesn't sound like a lot, but if the year before you only caught one or two. This photo here, the spotted flycatcher, actually wasn't taken at Carey. It was taken in the spring. I've concluded just to briefly mention it because it's quite an interesting bird. This was caught on the Calf of Man. And this bird, you can't see in the photo, was actually carrying or was ringed in Norway. It was a bit of a random one. It was the first spotted flycatcher of the spring that I caught. I got out the net and was like, oh, it's ringed. Oh, that's a bit random. Looked at the ring. Oh, it's from Norway. And it turned out to only be the second ever Norwegian spotted flycatcher to be caught in the UK. And only 3 UK ringed spotted flycatchers ever been caught in Norway. So there's only ever been 5 birds kind of transferred between Norway and the UK. And all of those other birds were caught on North Ronaldsay or the Isle of May. So I don't know what it was doing on the Calf of Man, the west coast of the UK. And interestingly, it was caught as an adult in May in 2024 in Norway, and we caught it again in May in 2025. So it wasn't even a juvenile the year before. It was ringed as an adult. It should have known where it was going. And this again, yeah, it was just a bit of a rogue bird. But again, it shows that there's perhaps more to learn. Perhaps this bird knew something we didn't, and it was changing its migration route, changing its breeding area. Maybe it was coming across to Scotland to breed instead of breeding in Norway. And so late sort of August into September, did see a few other sort of nice species towards the end of August. One of these was wryneck, quite a nice, again, cryptic, quite elusive bird. Interestingly, another one was caught last year, again in the end of August. And it makes you wonder exactly sort of their sort of status in the UK. There was a spring record locally, not too far away, last spring of a calling bird, and there was actually a bird relatively close to that this autumn. So whether or not they do breed in very small numbers in the south or across the UK, I always remember seeing birds reported at least in sort of August in Worcestershire when I used to live, where my parents live, and they just turn up in people's gardens, and it always makes you wonder if they bred locally, would anyone know? But they're definitely a sort of a nice bird, such a cryptic, such a stunning bird up close. And you can't catch a wryneck and not get a quick video. I don't know if it's going to play. Hopefully it will. Yeah, a quick video of They're sort of why they're called that. Quite interesting birds. They do this incredible sort of wry necky. It's not the best video, and he did it briefly. But yeah, they sort of move their head. I think this might be wrong actually, but I think it's meant to look snake-like, or that was a theory. It also makes you wonder how they named it. It obviously wasn't named in the field. It was obviously caught. Interestingly, kind of been shot, perhaps, to see that, because it's very rare to see them do it sort of in the wild as a sort of defensive mechanism. It's usually only when you catch them. So quite an interesting bird that is actually called wryneck, because most of them were sort of named after shot specimens. So presumably it was caught by somebody and they watched it do it. But such a sort of stunning bird to see in the hand. Another species that perhaps is not a common species to catch, but I thought I'd include because it's quite an interesting one, are these house martins. I find them relatively cute. Many people might not know, and I always try and show this to people if I ever have anyone ringing with me, is that they have fluffy feet. It kind of makes me think they're a bit of a wimp because all the other hirundines don't have fluffy feet. Sand martin swallows don't have fluffy feet, but house martins do. Presumably, it's when they're high in the sky, keep them warm. And these were just, they're a bird that they just random. As you can see, we did quite well. We caught 300. But most of them were on one day. This was the day where we caught 600 birds. It was over 250 or 260 house martins, 240 chiffchaffs. So there's two species basically dominated. And they're a bird that some days they will respond to tape and they'll come and they'll just fill the nets. And then other days they just don't care. And it's the same with swallow. We had days where we had 5,000 swallows passing over the site. None of them cared about the tape. And then the next day there'll be five around. You put the tape on, they fly straight into your net. I don't really understand why. I presume it's something to do with conditions. If the conditions are good, they want to move. They're daytime migrants. If it's nice weather, they want to migrate south. If it's slightly bad weather, they want to feed and they're happy to kind of sort of talk to each other. And all the birds we caught, as expected, were juveniles. And there's still very little known about house martins, actually. They're a bird that isn't caught in huge numbers. And the very little is actually known of where these winter. So in Africa, they know where house martins winter. They don't really know where UK breeding house martins winter, simply because they're so hard to catch. We did actually catch one with a ring on. We had this bird here that was ringed in the nest in sort of Scotland before we caught it down here. So that was one sort of bird. But yeah, so house martins obviously, yeah. So we move on. This species, the next species is not necessarily a migrant. It is a migrant, but it's sort of, I thought I'd include it mainly to talk about how common they are down here. Now I use common carefully, but firecrests, obviously in North Wales, I remember they're a nice bird. They're a bird that you tell people you've seen. You put them in your local WhatsApp. Sometimes they go on bird guides. But down in Dorset now, they are just doing exceptionally well. They are literally everywhere. In the spring, in the sort of when I arrived in midsummer and now in the spring, they're probably as common as goldcrests in some places. On site, we have multiple pairs. We've already, I think, caught this year, we caught 16 different birds, 13 different males. We think most of these are now on territory, so that's sort of huge numbers of firecrest now breed down in Dorset and along the south coast. But they're so rare elsewhere. So this autumn, we caught 36 during the autumn, decent numbers. And I know Stamford Reservoir, I go back to them, but they only caught one. And that was a good bird for them. And they're not that far north, really. We had lots of their birds. They're not that far north as the firecrest flies. But along the south coast, they're just doing really well. They just don't move. Now, in Giselle, on the other hand, the other ringing station, they did over 300 firecrests this autumn. So they are definitely a species that I think with climate change, they're just much better at adapting to sort of breeding in different types of habitats. A lot of people might know sandbanks, the sort of very nice, rich part of Poole where they've got really expensive houses. I was there the other day, and you can hear them calling in people's gardens. They're literally everywhere. We did get one bird that was ringed. Well, it was actually retrapped of a bird of ours. It didn't travel very far, and this probably is the reason why there's so few kind of up north. They just sort of they're not moving in large numbers, and they're kind of just moving east to west, just sort of small movements. In comparison, the Goldcrest, there's not many of these in Dorset as breeders, but you do get large arrivals up north. Obviously, you've got lots larger numbers up north, and obviously from the continent you get large arrivals. And we did much better for these. We struggled to catch them to begin with, but we ended up catching 330. This might not be fully correct, but there's been some discussion about Scandinavian Goldcrest versus UK breeding. And the idea is the grey, pale-headed Goldcrests are more likely Scandinavian birds. And if they've got longer wings, again, they're more likely to be Scandinavian birds. The birds further north are slightly bigger to cope with the cold. I think there was a study that showed that birds caught at Landguard and Suffolk had 2 millimeter longer wing lengths than birds caught on Lundy um, during the autumn. And though neither site ever caught one with a Norwegian ring or a foreign ring, just that data alone kind of suggests that the birds on the Suffolk coast presumably were coming from the continent, and that's why they were slightly bigger. Here again is just a graph. I tried to split adults and juveniles, but again, there wasn't much sort of correlation. I just sort of thought it would just be an added thing to add. And it's a bit of a hard graph to read because I've realized that it's not split up equally. So this is kind of July and August, and this is the start of September. So very, very few were caught early on. And this is basically an example of the fact that there's just so few breeding locally. And then once you got to sort of middle September, you started seeing this big increase. And these were late migrant, the chiff-chaff, we were sort of saying September. These are more of an October, sort of October, another peaks. This is end of October through to early November. So these are birds that are moving a lot later, presumably pushed more by the cold, um, rather than sort of the need to migrate somewhere, because they don't migrate as far as a lot of our other migrants. We did also get one or two, I think it was, with a ring on it. One of them was very brief movement, but we did get one from further north, which again kind of demonstrates roughly where the bird's coming from. Another species that I'll just briefly talk about are these, the stone chats, simply because we did really well for them. We caught 168 stone chats, which is quite a significant number. I think I had a look at the average number of adult stone chats ringed in the UK per year, and we did about, so I think it's 13 or 14% of what you'd expect people to ring adults. So as a site, we did extremely well for adult stone chats. And it was just a bird that seemed to just always be arriving. And they're not really a migrate. They're not really a typical migrant. You don't expect to see large numbers of them. They're just steady passage of them. And they're quite an interesting one because you get birds that don't really move. We did have a few of those. We had a couple that breed on site or locally, and we caught those multiple times, sort of adults and juveniles. And then we sort of got this early passage, sort of early August, which is presumably juvenile dispersal, birds breeding locally that were getting pushed off and moving. And then we got this sort of late September, early October passage, which again is probably birds moving south and dispersing. But we never saw more than maybe 10 to 15 on site in a day. But every day you're just getting new birds, you'd presume they were the same birds you saw yesterday, but you'd catch them, they'd be new. It's just another example of how you don't realize how many birds are passing through your local site. The birds you're seeing aren't the same as the other day. Unfortunately, we didn't do too well for their sort of cousin, the windchat. We only caught one. There was one day there was about 10 on site, and there were regular numbers during September when they were passing through. They're just quite a difficult species to catch, and we didn't do too well for them. They seem to always just outsmart the nets. And another species that, again, is not necessarily your typical migrant, but a bird that migrates nonetheless is Chessie's warblers. They do breed on site, and we did catch some birds that were caught as adults in previous years, and we caught their juveniles. But we did also get an arrival. They again follow the same sort of pattern of late July, early August, getting small numbers passing through, and then once it got to September and into October, we just get daily one or two birds. And these are obviously short-winged birds. They have a lot, as a warbler goes, they have very short wings. And they don't travel too far, but there was an interesting record that some of you may have seen of a bird caught in Sussex this year as a juvenile that bred on site that flew to Lancashire, which is almost the northerly tip of their breeding range or their sort of stronghold breeding range. So these birds can move large numbers or sorry, not large numbers, large distances, a lot further than people realize. And I know this year again was a good year for them. Bardsey had a record, I think it's like fourth record, and the Isle of Man, the Calf of Man, had their second ever record. So these are definitely a species that they did again. It was such a dry year. There was lots of insects. There wasn't a lot of rain at the start of the breeding season that caused birds to fail. And birds did extremely well, and there was large numbers of juveniles, and they obviously started dispersing and sort of turning up in other places. A species I didn't get a photo of, but I have included here. Another one is reed bunting. Again, these are an interesting one. just very briefly, yeah, one of the local birders who I know was sort of talking about this. There are birds you don't really see migrating. So as a vismig or a visible migration bird, there are sort of October, late September, October, November time. You sort of expect to see them, and we caught small numbers during that period. But they do breed on site, and that was why we had good numbers. This is a great example of where you put your nets up. Day one, you catch loads. The birds don't know where the nets are. They all go into the nets, and the next day you catch a lot less because they've learned where the nets are. And they just avoid them. So this is a great example, of where sort of or you catch all your breeding birds and you catch very few. But we did get this sort of big peak in August, and it went very quiet. In September, there was very few birds. Yeah, we caught the odd one, but whereas in August and July, there was 30, 40 on site every day, it sort of just died off. You don't see these birds. I know some birds were saying they were turning up on farmland and in other new and non-breeding habitats, but I don't know how they do it. I don't know if they move during the night or they just move they move slowly through the hedgerows and just disperse into other habitat. You just don't see vismig reed things very often in August. It's not until sort of late October when they sort of start moving properly. Perhaps it is a case of they're moving through the hedgerows, moving slowly in small distances before they do a sort of much larger movement later on. Sort of an iconic species down here is woodlark. We were fortunate to have some on site. I showed you the map earlier that had the acid grassland in the north, which is a molting site for woodlarks. We had about 25 to 30 woodlark molting on there. Unfortunately, it was during peak chiff-chaff time when the birds were there, so I didn't have as much time as I'd hoped to go out and catch some. We did catch 7 birds, and here you can sort of see the birds were molting, so they've got sort of shorter primaries. And we're hopefully going to learn a bit more about this. The site itself has one breeding pair, but in September you get this big arrival, about 30 birds. Don't know exactly where they come from and how important it is as a molting site, but it's not necessarily anything special. It's just sort of an acid grassland field surrounded by trees that the woodlark seems to just find safe to molt. Interestingly, a lot of these birds, obviously, many people know you can age. Woodlarks do a complete molt, so juveniles and adults. Same with skylarks, completely molt all their feathers. So once they've completed their molt in September, you can't age them. You don't know what age they are. They look the same, but you can age them early on. With the juveniles having the longer one of the features is the juveniles have this much longer P1 or primary one. The adults have a lot more shorter, worn primary one. And this is again an example. The juveniles have just grown these primaries out of the nest in June, May time, and they molt them again in September, which does sound a bit counterintuitive. That's why most birds don't molt until the following year, or juvenile birds don't. And the adults, because they've been struggling to feed their young, are a lot more worn, have a lot more shorter primary, first primary, just simply because it's worn away. So the sort of final few species that we got during the late autumn, one of these was lesser redpoll. So in general, lesser redpoll in Dorset actually isn't that much of a common bird. It's quite a sort of, not too common as a winter visitor. And this is kind of shown by one of the local ringing groups I remember was out ringing one day, and they posted a photo of one in the group chat going, "Oh, we caught a lesser redpoll this morning." It was kind of highlight of the day. And being in North Wales, I didn't necessarily sort of think much of it, and sort of thought, well, they're nice, but you catch them. But this is perhaps an example of sort of not knowing exactly what it's like around the country and how it varies so differently from sort of up north, when redpolls are a lot more common, and even in the Midlands where you get large numbers, you get very few along the south coast. And this is shown by last year, they only caught 12 on site. However, this year was just an exceptional year for redpoll. Some of you may have been aware of this, but there was just a huge number of redpoll passing through the country in October. We ended up catching 152 sort of during October and into November. We did stop in mid-November. If we'd carried on, you never know, we might have got a few more. But in general, just sort of good numbers of redpoll. Unfortunately, there was sort of a mid-morning bird. Interestingly, we saw a lot more going over and catching sort of 10, 11 o'clock. And lots of the time, it just got a bit too windy as the day sort of gone on to carry on ringing, unfortunately. So we didn't do as well as we could have done. But it was just an exceptional year for redpoll. And it was shown in this sort of tweet I've attached of my old ringing group in the West Midlands. Incredibly caught over 1,000 in 5 sessions, which is averaging 200 a session. And they didn't catch a single bird twice. So it was just an exceptional autumn for redpoll. Whether or not, I think it's also turning out to be quite an exceptional sort of spring for finches. There's huge numbers of siskin down here. A lot of other sites up north are sort of saying they're getting huge numbers of siskin, and presumably redpoll will start moving in quite large numbers soon. A few other species I've just added just to sort of nice sort of photos. One of them is water rail, another sort of migrant that might go very unnoticed. We didn't have any water rails on site during late July through till August until we caught this one in late August. And then from then on, we started seeing small numbers calling. But they are sort if you're ever lucky to see one this wow, or sort of, you sometimes you get lucky and you get to see them. Um, got a photo of it. I thought I'd just include that for anyone that maybe doesn't know. But a good feature to age them is sort of the throats. There are other ways, but one of the sort of things the juveniles have this rather nice pale throat. A species that's kind of iconic down south, but is a lot rarer for many of you in North East. Dartford warblers. Again, these are a bird that doesn't really migrate, extremely short winged, but you do get dispersed catching two birds. The previous year, the guy caught three. These were in the start of October in both years. So that seems to be sort of the first 2 weeks of October is peak time for sort of this kind of dispersal of local breeding birds. Um, and obviously, there's no breeding habitat that close to the site. Maybe 5 miles away. There's some heaths that they do breed on, but the site itself isn't really dark warbler habitat, but they do sort of pass through, and we were lucky to get two. Other sort of species we caught in lesser numbers, yellowhammer, again, a species that you don't necessarily realize, but they are passing through. We only caught one, they caught eight. Again, in sort of October time, you sort of see these sort of finch bunting passages. And meadow pipit, we didn't do too well for them, mainly due to bad weather during peak 220 meadow pipit. So maybe I shouldn't complain too much. But again, a good pattern at the right time of year. And as you get towards the end of the autumn, you start seeing the redwings. And these were generally here for redwing. There was quite an early passage where birds sort of arrived into the UK and it kind of looked like it could be amazing. And then it kind of stopped. And it took us a while to catch some. As I said, we only caught one field fair. And we didn't do too well, but I have included this just to show you quite interesting. You get adults first with redwing. It seems to always be the case. The adults move first, and then you get the juveniles. You always catch more juveniles than adults because, again, they're more likely to respond to the tape. But yeah, you always get very small passage of adults, and then you start seeing the juveniles. And once the juveniles come, again, I think this year, especially down south here in Dorset, we didn't start seeing sort of big numbers until the start of November. And whether or not we probably would have carried on getting more if we'd carried on. A few other things I've included just very brief to sort of show you what other things you can learn, I guess, from ringing and some of the other things you sometimes catch was I thought I can't do it, I could not talk about blue tits, the sort of iconic bird that ringers either hate or love or hate them. But interestingly, quite a large numbers of these sort of melanistic, slightly darker individuals. I haven't done the maths, I haven't got around to it because it's unfortunately just labeled in the ringing book. But I'd say probably 3 to 5 birds down here seem to have this sort of darker feathers to them. We don't really get many leucistic birds, but yeah, birds seem to have this sort of very dark features to them, which may be something. I know there was one in North Wales in Tom, one of my mates' garden. We had one sort of looking like this, but down here there seems to be quite numbers. Presumably it's a genetics thing, but it does look quite cool when you sort of see a slightly different looking blue tip. Finally, we finished with perhaps the prettiest bird of the night, the wood pigeon. It's a bit of a just maybe what is it? The face only a mother would love. This juvenile, it's not the prettiest, but they are a bird that I think a lot of people neglect. A lot of people don't look at wood pigeons and they're not really a bird that are caught very often. We only caught 3 wood pigeons. This bird almost death right. I think we caught it in mid-August. I was quite excited to catch one. You don't catch very often, but didn't really think much of it. But this then went on a bit of an adventure, this wood pigeon, and it ended up getting found dead in France. So it actually flew across the channel. It was found dead on the 22nd of December. Now, whether or not I don't know. Unfortunately, we don't know if it was long dead or fresh dead. They didn't give us that information. But this the channel. And a lot of you will know in the start of November, you get these huge pigeon migrations, which is still very little to know about them. They think they go to Spain, forests around Madrid. On clear days, you can get thousands, tens of thousands. I think the UK record is about 250,000 passing through in a single morning. But no one really knows exactly which bird, whether or not it's the urban bird, whether or not one of the birds in your garden decides to fly to Spain and the other one to stay and eat your seed. or if it's the ones that breed in woodlands or ones that breed down south. And this perhaps shows an example of, yeah, there's still a lot more to learn about wood pigeons. But yeah, it shows never really quite know when it comes to ringing what you might learn when you catch a bird. So I don't take any questions, but I just thought I'd include the sort of the full species list. I didn't actually write a total. I think it was 72 species. It shows you what we caught. I think the highlight, one of the highlights, I think, is the fact that blue tit isn't very high, and we caught a lot more warblers than sort of your kind of common garden birds. So we did quite well for those things. But yeah, I think that's the end of the talk. If anyone has any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Ed. I don't know about quite well. It was brilliant. Uh, I'm sure that'll have prompted a lot of questions. I, I think it's supposed to be once every, or sort of every 12 years they have a peak, and um, I don't know, uh, on what data that's based, but anyway, it'd be interesting to see whether your ringing reflects that in any way over the coming years. Um,
Yeah, I think, like I said, I think last year they did 280 and this year was 480. So
right.
obviously weather and so on, it's quite hard to compare just 2 years on the trot.
Yeah,
Because obviously if you get a few days of bad weather, it can really affect your numbers. So yeah, it would be, perhaps there might be a year when we're going to get even more. But yeah, I think they're definitely one of the ones we want to sort of look a bit more into because yeah, we're definitely a sort of understudied species.
we've had a question from Alex Gould about your plans for next year and future ringing activities. Is there a strategy, or will it be carry on as you've done this year?
Yeah, actually, I was going to actually mention that. I think I forgot. But yeah, so the site itself, it was a trial run. There was the odd ringing was done a few years ago since they bought the site. In 2024, again, I said somebody ringed it for the autumn. They did it again this year, and it's now the idea is to set this up as kind of a ring station where we'll get visiting ringers, but also visiting bird watchers, people that don't know about ringing, to sort of show them ringing, teach them ringing. And the idea is to, ideally to sort of ring it the whole of the autumn, but also try the spring. We have already, to be honest, we've already started ringing this year already. We're sort of kind of continue the monitoring, sort of set the site up, sort of be kind of like a yeah, like a sort of a training ringing station, sort of allow for demonstrations of what ringing is. And that's kind of the hope or going forwards, kind of yeah. And obviously, like I said, the site is being rewilded, so it will change rapidly, hopefully, and it will look very different. There's a few things hopefully we might get to do. So it will be interesting to see how that this kind of the baseline, this is kind of the baseline data, I guess. In
Yeah.
theory, this is the minimum um, number
Mm.
of birds that should use the site. The idea is if we do the right things, there should be more and more as the year as sort of
Mm.
time goes on,
Mm.
which would be yeah, quite mad if you get more than this, I guess.
Yeah, you'll certainly be needing an assistant yourself. But no, that sounds good. A good plan. And that, I think Alex was also interested in and how much you coordinate or combine efforts with other Dorset ringing sites.
Yeah, so I actually should have said this. I've just realised I didn't. I forgot the sort of the thank you. But obviously, like I said, it was obviously funded by Mark. But a lot of my work was helped by the local ring groups, so the Star Ring Group. A
Yeah,
lot of ringers used to come and help me. Without them, I would have struggled to catch this many birds alone. You can't really do it.
no,
So I sort of relied on other people. Fortunately, my partner Kate is going to take on the job with me next year. So we'll have two people be able to ring because it
oh,
was kind of a case where I had to kind of yeah, message a lot of local people to try and convince them to come along and help me. So the idea is that we sort of had a lot of help from them, and hopefully now we can kind of get a few more people on board, and then try and get sort of like visiting ringers from around the country to come down and help
yeah,
the site and kind of yeah keep the data going. A bit like Icklesham, I haven't really mentioned that, but a lot of people might have heard of Icklesham,
mhm,
another sort of ring site that was funded by a banker in London who just kind of learned about ringing and wanted to fund it and had lots of money. It's kind of died off a little bit. The funding's gone, but there are still people that do it, sort of retired ringers that still ring the site. It's not as big as it used to be. They don't have many people, but the idea is to kind of set this up under a similar kind of remit, I guess. They did very well. I think I looked at some of their totals the other day, and I think one year they did 7,000
mhm.
acros in one autumn. So I think we've still got a long way to go to beat that. But yeah.
No, you made a great start. Any other questions? Well, I think probably the audience is still taking in all the information that you gave there, Ed. I mean, in terms of concentrated information power, that was right up up there as our talks have gone, and and for that reason alone, we really got our money's worth out of you this evening for sheer fact of the subject. But fact can be boring without the proper interpretation, either from uh, the narrator, the speaker, i.e., you, and also the visuals, which were really exemplary. I thought this was such an excellent use of a PowerPoint in giving us data, visuals, and descriptions all beautifully linked together. It was really clear and concise in that respect, and that's how you managed to fit in so much interesting information in what an hour's time. And so much of that was, I'm sure, was certainly new for me. I'm sure for many people in the audience. And it, what really came through was your dedication and those of you that help, the sheer hours spent in the field preparing for the ringing, but also putting the data together, analysing it, and then putting this talk together. That requires a hell of a lot of effort at all those stages. But the end result was so worthwhile. Just some fascinating stuff there, which is largely, as you suggested at the beginning, just goes unnoticed and sometimes really unthought about. And it's only through this intense ringing that we can get any angle on what birds are really doing and what is really happening. And you've done that already so successfully with the prospect of so much more to come on such a wide variety of bird species. That's what I also liked about it. You weren't just looking at familiar tits and other passerines, but a whole range of other super species. It's clearly got wonderful potential. And I hope that a lot of your data can be used in a truly scientific way to understand bird behavior and to inform bird conservation. It's a very high quality and all strength to you in your new role in continuing this and also influencing others to do the same. Because the thought of having bird ringing stations of this intensity and activity, not just around the coast but inland, is really exciting. And we've had some great talks over the years from coastal ringing sites, not just in Britain but Europe wide and North America. But to have one that is looking more at inland migration, inland movement, inland dispersal is just so interestingly complementary to the coastal stuff. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. We're
Yeah, I
thrilled
say,
that you are where you are and you're doing what you're doing. And good luck to you for this coming season. I'm sure you're already getting very excited about the breeding season itself, and of course, spring migration. I hope you get loads of interesting retraps, etc. And look forward to hearing more from you in the future, Ed. And I hope you get some spare time to look at the other fascinating birds down south. And thanks for giving us a flavour of those in Poole Harbour as well at the beginning. We're much obliged to you for giving up your evening. I hope it doesn't come at the end of an early start bird ringing this morning. I forgot to ask you whether you've been up at the crack of dawn bird ringing. But anyway, thank you for your time, whatever your situation. And thanks to your partner for all the help that they've given in putting the talk together as well. So all the best and thank you from us all up here in a dry North Wales down to you in a wet Dorset, soggy Dorset, I believe. Yeah. Thank
no,
you,
yeah,
Ed.
no, yeah. Thank you for having me.